Hello and welcome to a series of short online lectures covering principles for ecological planning and open space design for landscape architects. Today we'll be discussing the ecological design principle that states, when designing, try to preserve large patches of habitat to maintain core habitat and to reduce edge effects. In 2018, I challenged a group of landscape architecture students at Purdue University to summarize what they thought were some of the most important things to them when it came to ecological design. And this is what they came up with. They began to think about state parks and the role that landscape architects had in setting aside nature preserves and areas that are managed for wildlife versus setting aside the more recreationally intensive landscapes, the constructed elements that are found within those, such as at Turkey Run State Park in Indiana. They went further to begin to build upon what we as a class had discussed about in terms of the contributions of people like Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold fundamentally challenged us as landscape architects to participate in spatial problem solving when it came to managing our landscape. One of the key principles that Leopold brought to this conversation was the principle of composition. Composition is what we often as landscape architects would simply refer to as current conditions inventory. Right? We look at the landscape when we record on a map, what are the different uses that we see around the landscape? But Leopold would encourage us to go much further. Leopold would say that we truly need to understand how that landscape is functioning, to understand how it's managed, to understand how that affects the quality of the landscape elements that we see there. If you simply were to say, well, there's some woods within this landscape, as he did within the Riley Game Cooperative analysis in Dane County, Wisconsin, on the map provided here. Along Sugar Creek, there certainly are some woods. But he went further than that. He went into a management and started breaking it apart to understand that grazed versus ungrazed woods are different. Right? The act of putting cattle on the landscape and allowing them in amongst the trees can not only damage the large trees, but they trample the understory and they change the composition of the forest. As we talk about composition, we need to engage in the modern conversation with landscape ecologists who talk about landscape structure. And for that, I need to introduce some basic vocabulary to you. The basic vocabulary you need to understand is that landscape ecologists use the term matrix. And when they talk about a matrix, what they're actually talking about is the landscape's general type or the dominant land cover characteristic of a landscape. And we're not talking about landscapes in terms of kind of the small, single site focused area that we're looking at. We're actually talking about the regional scale, right? The large landscape within which we put multiple communities. And we're trying to understand its ecological function. As we look at the picture on the right side, what jumps out at you as the dominant land cover characteristic? Well, certainly I can see development encroaching in the foreground, but as I look to the background of this picture, what I really see is that this is a forested landscape. And so we would refer to this as a forest matrix with patches of development and patches of agriculture encroaching upon it. I just used the term patches, so let's talk about what that is. We understand that the landscape matrix can change over time. But when the matrix changes, it's often fragmented into small, isolated areas of similar uses. Right? So the forest becomes a series of chunks of forest, and agriculture maybe becomes the dominant landscape matrix. And what we're left with are remaining wildlife habitat patches. Understanding that in all situations, almost all situations, that large areas of contiguous habitat are better than smaller areas. This is something that we can take back into our design. This is how the regional shrinks back to the local or the site level. Within our designs, we should often look at ways of connecting and maintaining large blocks of habitat rather than fragmenting them into smaller pieces. The reason behind this can be talked about in many different ways, but at a regional scale, I just want to put an example in front of you. For a number of years I spent in Wisconsin. I worked with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to help manage the greater prairie chicken. The greater prairie chicken is a species once found throughout the entire state of Wisconsin and all of its counties that has shrunk back in terms of its range, the places where it lives, just to this small area in central Wisconsin. And over the last 30 years, there's been a steady decline. Actually, we've seen a loss of 75% of all individuals, meaning the population has actually declined by 75% in real time. And what's left is that 90% of the prairie chickens remaining are in 4 major wildlife areas maintained by the Department of Natural Resources, spread out across an intensively agricultural landscape today. As we look at landscape change, though, there's multiple factors at play here. And one of my graduate students, Jacob Hernandez, did this analysis. The map is actually showing you where we've lost grassland. This was a grassland matrix. But it was only a grassland matrix because the early settlers of this area cut the forest and raised cattle on this land. And so what we're seeing now is that row crop agriculture has begun to encroach back in and take the grassland out and turn it into corn production primarily. But we're also seeing forestry, so basic succession processes, the things in the soil that it was originally intended for, the forest is creeping back in as well. But the broader impact for this particular species is that between 1992 and 2010, Jacob identified that it had lost 250,000 acres of habitat, a dramatic change in the overall landscape matrix. When we talk about habitat fragmentation, it's important to understand that ecologists will speak about this in terms of multiple types of fragmentation. We can talk about early stage fragmentation where we start to break the landscape up into smaller pieces, or disturb corridors that connect those pieces and further isolate, so shredding. Initial exclusion in terms of fragmentation means that species are pushed out, meaning that we've cleared the habitat and removed it from the landscape, and so they're forced to disperse. Crowding effect often happens when we remove so much of the habitat that the only remaining places are too small to support the population that's there. And so there's no longer enough food, water, or shelter to support the number of individuals left within a particular wildlife species in that area. And that ultimately will lead to local and regional extinctions of animals, the final consequence. But one thing I'd like to share with you here is that Google's developed this tool, and there's a link here for you to follow, that allows us to actually go look at this in real time, or at least, in a series of time progression, so landscape change over time. This happens to be in the state of Rondônia in Brazil. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at agricultural production creeping into the Amazon rainforest. This is in 1984. As I flash forward to last year, in 2018, what you see is a dramatic change in the landscape matrix. No longer do we have a consistent forest matrix. We now have competition between agriculture and forest for the dominant landscape characteristic. Leopold also addressed the concept of edge and began describing the impact of edge on species, understanding that the edge of a habitat block, right, the edge of a patch, does not serve all animals equally. And what he really means by this, flashing forward, is that habitat quality varies. So instead of having a large, if we have an example here, the big green circle, we say, look, we have a great large piece of intact habitat. It'll be good for all the wildlife in the area, and they'll all benefit from this. But the reality of it is that we've cut away some of the habitat around that, and this is all that remains. And the area around the perimeter, the edge, is not high-quality habitat for the species that want to live there. The edge is more suited to edge specialists, generalists that can cross a lot of different types of landscapes. And you can see this in a lot of different ways. We drive utility corridors through forests. We split up the landscape along large rivers with agriculture. We put infrastructure, railways, roadways in between habitat, increasing the edge effect and reducing the overall size of intact habitat patches. Sometimes we often make the mistake of deciding that a linear corridor will be great for the wildlife and will save them, but if the linear corridor isn't wide enough, the entire thing becomes edge. And edge is really wonderful for edge specialists. Species that are very common in suburban backyards and fully developed landscape matrices. Raccoons and deer and robins and rabbits are all well and good, but these are specialists. It means that they work really well in these degraded landscapes, and their population grows rapidly, often producing human-wildlife conflict. They also push out other species, and they reduce overall biodiversity because they're prolific breeders, and they can use many different types of landscape to their benefit. Ultimately, interspersion is where Leopold talks about the overall permeability of landscapes for different species. And what I mean by this is that it's not enough to just have a habitat patch and then all the animals will go live there and it will be fine, right? There's enough changes, both natural and human caused, that we need to understand that you need to have a landscape that allows for these wildlife to move across it, to change their habitat, to grow their range, to disperse. And so I want to introduce the concept of dispersal as we talk about connecting habitats together. Interspersion and dispersal is this basic principle. If the orange areas here represent different wildlife habitats suitable for a species that we're interested in managing for, and one of them is removed because of a natural event, such as a tornado, or flooding, or it could be that we're developing on a particular part of the landscape, where do those animals go? Well, in a landscape with good interspersion, there'd be opportunities for them to move on and find new homes and find their own niche within the existing landscape. But what happens when the next push or the next event pushes that habitat out? Where do they go? What if we've already leapfrogged and changed the landscape out here and we've lost this patch or lost all of the other patches and now we just have an isolated remnant? When we leave this on the landscape, what happens to those species that live there? I'll tell you the answer is that it's not good. Which leads us to lots of conversations with ecologists about corridors, connecting habitat patches together to effectively increase the area for wildlife and allow for wildlife dispersal. But I don't want you to put the idea of a hallway in your head. Too often people think if I just build a green hallway between two large patches of habitat, it'll be good for the species, we'll have solved the problem. Interspersion suggests to us that you have to create a landscape that allows different wildlife species to find their niches in a variety of different places. It's not enough to have a tree line that connects two habitat patches together. Wildlife don't move down a trail like we humans do on a bike trail through a rural landscape. And I can't have a conversation about habitat patches, landscape matrix, and wildlife management without at least introducing the grizzly bear. One of the things I'd like you to note is that on the map that's presented here of North America, at the corner where Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming all come together, there's a little green dot. And that little green dot is basically the size of Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone, and a few other parks to the north of it, have long become the last remnant populations of grizzly bears in North America, or in the lower 48, excuse me. And one of the things that's important to consider here is that for a long time, a lot of people thought that it'd be possible to save the grizzly bear species by simply saving Yellowstone National Park. But there's a problem. One, the bears didn't know where our boundaries were at. And two, the other reality is that when food became scarce within Yellowstone because of natural cycles of drought or flooding, the bears had to roam outside of that. And if those bears couldn't find suitable habitat in the surrounding landscape, then even Yellowstone, as large as it is, it's an amazingly large landscape that's protected for everyone. But even with that, it wasn't enough to actually save the grizzly bear species. And this is leading people to have much more complicated discussions about continental scale efforts to produce ecological plans to save large species. The concept of rewilding has taken off, and it basically comes back to this quote. It says, to practice serious conservation in North America, we must practice conservation on the scale of North America. This means considering where we intend to protect core wildlife habitat, large protected core areas, about corridors and interspersion and creating permeable landscapes. It's also about carnivores and their role within the landscape as well, How do we ensure that we actually have a complete wildlife assemblage? And why landscape architects are engaged in these conversations? Because at the end of the day, landscape architecture as a profession has stated that sustainable development is part of our professional identity. It's who we are. And in that, we must recognize where these terms came from. The Brundtland Report in 1987 captured the collective effort of world leaders to come together and define what sustainable development means. It says development that meets the needs of our present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But it also goes on further, and it says the environment is where we all live, and development is what we all do in attempting to improve our lot within that abode. The two are inseparable. Landscape architects live at the intersection of development and natural resource protection. It means that we have to develop our abilities to work across scale, going from the region to the site. Too often we think of our client presents us with a site, and we look to the boundaries of that site, and that's it. We have to zoom out further. We also have to identify opportunities to guide and shape rural landscape planning efforts, to engage in a broader practice of landscape architecture that looks at problem solving from a regional perspective and bringing it down to the actual built landscape environment at the site level. I'm going to leave you with this final quote from Ian McCard. He says, "The ecological view requires that we look upon the world, listen, and learn." Thank you for your time and attention today. I hope you enjoyed this lecture about ecological design principles.